During the persecutions of the emperors Decius and Valerian, when Pope Cornelius in Rome and Bishop Cyprian in Carthage shed their blood in blessed martyrdom, many churches in Egypt were laid waste by the fury of the storm. While such enormities were being perpetrated, a certain Paul and his newly married sister were bereaved of both their parents, he being about 16 years of age. He was heir to a rich inheritance, highly skilled in both Greek and Egyptian learning, gifted with a gentle disposition and a deep love for God. Amid the thunders of persecution, he, his sister, and brother-in-law retired to a house at a considerable distance and in a more secluded spot. But to what crimes does not the accursed thirst for gold impel the human heart?
What are you doing?
His brother-in-law conceived the thought of betraying the youth.
Cannot I, nor the ties of family, nor the oaths in eye of God, turn you from this evil.
The young man had the foresight to understand this, and, conforming his will to the necessity, fled to the mountain wilds to wait for the end of the persecution.
The Desert Fathers are the ascetics of the Egyptian wilderness, okay? They're the ones who fled society, fled the cities, and went off to live in the wilderness to achieve union with God.
What they wanted to do is to free themselves from the mire of contemporary life, that after the Christianity had been accepted and embraced by the culture, there was a movement to mediocrity, to lukewarmness, watering down or domestication of the spiritual life as a whole. And they did not simply want to remove themselves from that, but to enter into the spiritual life fully.
It became really a worldwide movement, the idea of renouncing everything in order to follow Christ in the desert, right, and to live a certain style of life which was very simple, very rigorous, which seemed to correspond to what they were reading in the Gospels. Anyone who does not renounce all his goods cannot be my disciple.
Jerome is trying to establish why the movement in the desert was so successful. Despite the fact that it was austere, it was very difficult, why it became such a foundation. And to do that, Jerome needs to explain who the founders are, about who they were, how they acted, how they interacted with each other.
The question is, who was the first hermit in the desert? St. Jerome is very interested in perhaps saying, well, yeah, everybody's heard about St. Anthony, but he's not, in fact, the first one. I'm going to tell you about somebody who is perhaps a better representation of desert spirituality than Anthony. Antony, he says, lived in a group of people and was called spiritually to go to the desert, whereas Paul is an ordinary person who, living with apparently a sister and brother-in-law, and the brother-in-law is greedy for his inheritance, and in a time of the empire's torturing of Christians, decides he has to get away from all that, not because he's called by God, at least as far as he knows, but because he's an ordinary person who needs to get away from domestic and civic difficulties.
Here you have this individual who, to save his soul from very concrete obstacles, takes a very concrete and specific step. Go far away from family, inheritance, arguments, and fuss, and then really live the Christian life in this solitary way.
We find many stories like St. Paul's of fleeing to the desert simply to get away from those realities, either because of guilt or a desire for something else in their life, and finding themselves immersed in something that awakens a part of their life that they were not aware of.
At length, he found a rocky mountain, at the foot of which was a cave. He made eager search and saw within a large space, open to the sky, shaded by the branches of a palm.
What we forget about ancient times is that they were times of great tumult. That the 2nd century, the 3rd century, the 4th century were times of great social upheaval, times of catastrophic climate change, times of pandemic, one epidemic after another sweeping the empire, reducing the population of the empire by 1/3. You know, imagine the kind of societal impact of these cataclysms, these events. Well, the fathers, in a sense, were removing themselves from all those upheavals and going out to the desert where they could find a certain stillness. And that's immensely attractive in the world we're living in today.
Inasmuch as both Greek and Roman writers have handed down careful accounts of Anthony, who many maintain was the originator of the desert hermit's way of life, I have determined to write a short history of Paul's early and latter days, what his middle life was like, and what snares of Satan he experienced. No man, it is thought, has yet discovered.
Father Anthony, what must one do in order to please God?
Pay attention to what I tell you. Whoever you may be, always have God before your eyes. Whatever you do, do it according to the testimony of the Holy Scriptures. And whatever place you live, do not easily leave it. person who abides in solitude and quiet is delivered from fighting 3 battles: hearing, sight, and speech. Then there remains one battle to fight: the battle of the heart.
I think what we have to do is we have to use our imagination and move into the inner experience of Paul as he needs to come close to that moment, that turning point, when his escape from the entanglements of social life has to shift towards a movement towards something higher. Right, that there's this transition moment, and we're really looking at that with our imagination because we don't have specific evidence of it from the biography that has come down to us.
We can only imagine how difficult life would have been. We have to remember that at that time there was no rule book of how to live in the desert. There was no rule book of how to live as an ascetic. It was everything that he learned in the desert was self-taught. And life in the desert is not easy. It's only when you're in the desert and you're completely alone that you're actually forced to face all of your fears and your insecurities and your inefficiencies. But in doing that, you also become very close to God, because you get to a point where there is nothing and no one to rely on other than God Himself.
So in our imaginative recreation of this moment in his life, we have to almost get into the memory of this saint, remembering, recalling, and being impelled by those memories. His mother, a meal prepared, her words at that time of his coming to maturity.
It's your big day. And with that, you will look the man you are.
He's still wearing the tunic that he had received from his family when he reached maturity, and they celebrated his birthday, and he's now I am a man, now I am an adult, now I'm a prominent member of the community, and I take my place in society. And that tunic represents all of those family ties and community ties. And now having to deal with it as it begins to fall away, as it rots off his body, and he realizes that now it's a turning point, all right, a time to make a decision.
Let us not deem that we're doing something great, for the suffering of the present times are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed to us. Nor let us think, as we look at the world, that we have renounced anything of much consequence, for the whole earth is very small compared with the heavens.
O desert, bright with the flowers of Christ! O solitude, whence come the stones of which, in the Apocalypse, the city of the great King is built? O wilderness, gladdened with God's special presence! What keeps you in the world, my brother, you who are above the world? How long shall gloomy roofs oppress you? How long shall smoky cities confine you? Paul, regarding his abode as a gift from God, fell in love with it. and there in solitude spent all the rest of his life. The palm afforded him food and clothing.
Being stripped down to nothing, having to eat dates, to clothe himself in palm branches, he was reduced to a very minimal state, and from our perspective, of how a human being was to live. But in that limited state, he discovered something far greater.
One of the lessons of Paul's experience in the desert is of learning to simplify one's diet and to rely on nature itself to provide. That leaves more time for prayer and meditation. In the meditation practice, it was the short prayer like the Kyrie eleison or, "O God, come to my assistance, O Lord, make haste to help me." So these short prayers, usually borrowed from psalm verses, were the meditative or contemplative prayer to which a great deal of time was dedicated. So there's the element of time dividing up the day into sections for prayer, for meditation, for manual labor, and for meal times, and for rest.
The asceticism of the Desert Fathers wasn't something that was new with the 4th century or the 3rd century. I think that it has always been there in biblical religion.
Abraham was called to leave Ur, the great metropolis of Mesopotamia in his day, and to go out into the wilderness to a land I will show you, God says. That land was geographical, Canaan, but also God showed him the inner landscape of his soul as he wandered through as a nomad, learning to trust God's voice, learning to hear God's voice in his heart. And so encountering God in the wilderness has always been part of that great tradition.
When God made the heavens and the earth was a formless void. You know, the Hebrew language there that's used is the same language that's used in Israel's wandering through the desert. If God wanted to, he could have took a much more direct route to the promised land. But instead he led his people through a wilderness, through a place where they were right up against their own poverty and their need for God. And so it was in this place that God taught his people to rely upon him for all things.
John the Baptist comes out of the desert wearing skins, eating honey and locusts. This wild, hairy, shaggy man from the wilds is baptizing the Son of God. And then Christ is tested in the desert. He spends 40 days in the desert. He moves around the small towns. He's never in the urban centres. He's always on the margins. He's specifically with the people on the margins, but also he's in quite marginal places. And so when the Desert Fathers go back into the desert, there's a relationship they can have with Christ that maybe we couldn't have in the city alone. In this very urbanised, over-civilised culture that we're in now, it's a radical lesson.
So often in our world today, we are looking for a spiritual transformation. We are looking for a way of detaching from materialism and searching for something that is more spiritual. We think of mindfulness, we think of nature walks, detachment. So we're doing all of these things in order to recover our inner self, and also for us to recover our relationship with nature at large.
We're expected to be online all the time, communicating this, that and the other. And this is seen as a virtuous thing. This kind of public openness, and the lives of the Desert Fathers is a radical rejection of that. That way of life where, like Paul, You're forced out into the desert, you embrace it, and you're there, and most of your life is not known except to God. The stillness and the silence inside you is the place you find God. So you go to a cave, you go to a forest, because the distractions have gone, the worldly distractions have gone, and you can concentrate entirely on finding the kingdom within.
We have to make room for solitude in our life. And that means reshaping our life as a whole. We remove the things from our life that, while benign, not necessarily sinful or evil, become distractions for us that pull us away from God and also away from the opportunity for deep prayer. Life in such a way would look much different for us. It would be becoming desert fathers within the world, I think, is what we are ultimately called to be.
Any simple approach to diet cuts down the amount of time needed to go about worrying about food. And of course, out in the desert, there's no supermarket, right? So you have these things at your fingertips, you gather them, you boil some water, and you make yourself some soup, and that's your meal, all right? And that's fine, and you can actually live reasonably well with that. That leaves more time for prayer and meditation.
Once, a demon appeared and dared to say, "I am the power of God. I am providence. What do you wish I shall give you?" It happened this way. While I was fasting, he came full craft, under the semblance of a monk, with what seemed to be loaves, and gave me counsel, saying, "Eat and cease from your many labors. Thou also art a man, and are likely to fall sick." But I, perceiving his device, rose up to pray, and he endured it not, for he departed, and through the door there seemed to go out as if for smoke.
The true desert is the human heart that's been ravaged by sin. It's an uninhabitable place. It's a place of howling wilderness. It's a place of chaos, where the demons are waging war, competing for our souls.
Paul.
Who's there?
You are hungry. Why should you be? You have stayed here to follow him. And what has he given you? Eat and be comforted.
Man does not live by bread alone. Man does not live by bread alone. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God.
There's this great reading from St. Augustine, where Augustine says that it is in Christ that you are tempted. It is in Christ that you fast. The biggest reason why we ought to fast is because Christ fasted. And not just because he commanded us to fast, but by virtue of our baptism and our sharing in Christ's body, when we fast, we share in his fast.
The focus of our fasting is Christ himself, who is the bread of life. So the hunger, the emptiness that we feel within ourselves, opens our minds and our hearts to Christ, the bread of life, whose love alone can fill the deepest longings of the human heart.
Remember, when Christ goes into the wilderness for 40 days, Christ is fasting, and Christ is building strength for a very difficult mission and ministry. And so in fasting, there's a type of disciplining, but it's to prepare for mission, for ministry, to prepare oneself for service.
The Desert Fathers talked about the passions. One general theme is that to start to work on those, you begin with the stomach. They talk about the hypocrisy of the stomach giving you signals that it's hungry when your body actually has enough. It's just that emotionally you're craving connection, you're craving love. So you start by challenging that.
I'm sure we've all experienced it on a day that's very busy. We can skip breakfast and lunch and all of a sudden at night discover that we're hungry with no problems at all because we're busy the whole day. But as soon as we dedicate a day to fasting, well, geez, we've had a slice of bread and a coffee in the morning, it's 9 o'clock and we're ravenously hungry. When we do something for a spiritual purpose, somebody doesn't like us doing it. Be it the world and secular culture, be it Satan and the demons, or our very bodies, our greatest enemy, the body that we inhabit and live, the body that's been wounded by original sin, and the body that does whatever it wants to do.
So fasting can mean a lot of different things. It can mean that you delay the time of your meal. It can mean that you change the nature of your meal. It can mean that you simply don't eat for a certain period of time. And the body can be trained. I think anybody who likes to go camping and hiking knows that if you're carrying your food on your back and you make a camp, you've hiked miles and miles and miles. You've got all sorts of physical exertion. What's the reality? You eat about a third as much or half as much food as you do normally. And you realize the body can survive on that. In fact, the body can flourish on that. So maybe there's a little dietary wisdom in some of these early stories as well.
In the Western Church, there are 2 days, Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and the fasting is very limited, as you know. 2 small meals, 1 regular meal, which is typically what people do anyways. But in the minds of the fathers, this was not fasting, because you're breaking the fast the moment that you eat. And having fasted become episodic, even reduced to twice a year, strips it of its power to be transformative. They understood, like any other ascetic practice, that it was to be a daily part of our life. And it was only over the course of years, perhaps decades, that we begin to see the fruit of it. Now, everyone within the world necessarily isn't called to this kind of regular fast, but I think what we learn from that is that fasting is to be a regular part of our spiritual discipline, and that it's essential in not only deepening our prayer and our hunger for God, but in humbling the body and overcoming the passions. being fed by animals. Also in the scriptures we see this, with some of the prophets being prepared for the task that God was calling them to do. And we see this similarly in the life of St. Paul.
Neither did the Hebrews wait too long before they were fed with bread from the Almighty.
Il Signore provvedeva anche in modo miracolo, per esempio, perché a San Paolo un corvo gli porta ogni giorno una pagnotta, mezza pagnotta di pane, ecco così. Allora, come prima i corvi portavano del pane a Sant'Elia, appunto, no? Ecco così. Allora anche il monaco viene presentato come una figura anche profetica. In ogni caso, il Signore si prende cura di colui che si fida del Signore come un bambino.
The fruits of the earth are not brought to perfection immediately, but by time, rain, and care. Similarly, the fruits of men ripen through ascetic practice, study, perseverance, self-control, and patience.
Paul represents actually monastic virtue: silence, solitude, stability, humility, utter dependence on God. He is the perfect monk. He's the perfect desert father.
Let us hold fast our discipline and not be careless, but as ordering our daily life, we shall neither have lust for anything, nor cherish wrath against any, nor shall we heap up treasure upon earth. For if we also live under the daily expectation of death, ever striving and looking forward to the day of judgment, we shall not sin.
Human beings do need structure. I mean, from the very beginning, the first thing that God created was light, and then he shaped that light into sun and moon and stars, which told the times and seasons, as the book of Genesis says, right? God made us a clock even before he made us. And even in the desert, there were rules to live by.
The Desert Fathers ordered everything to union with Jesus Christ. It was all about their walk with Christ. It was all about the purgation that was necessary in order to get there. It was all about the illumination that was necessary in order to get there. So their entire life was ordered to that end. And we can learn a lot from that.
There are some professional people who work 60 or 70 hours a week, right, maybe with their eyes gazing at a computer screen. Well, how could this possibly be good for your body, not to mention your mind? Is it any wonder that depression is widespread and why people seek refuge in drugs, alcohol, pornography, and any number of other distractions to in some way recover? They're grabbing at the missing state of inner peace. The real challenge of reflecting on the Desert Fathers is, can we change this system? Can we change this way of defining what is normal and normative for human beings that actually causes us to deteriorate? It ruins our health, it ruins our peace, and it even ruins the creativity that we need to innovate and move forward into the future.
In many ways, reading the Fathers is a dangerous thing because it turns our life upside down. All of a sudden, life does not begin and end with the ego, with the self. It begins and ends with God. I think the struggle for us today is that we create a schedule for ourselves, including our spiritual life, that is placed along with other things that we do. And this is not how the Fathers thought, that Christ cannot be something that we check off on our daily to-do list. The desire there is to have one's whole life, work, sleep, eating, engagement with others, to be centered upon Christ, to begin with Him and lead to Him.
That they may get knowledge, the Greeks lived abroad and crossed the sea. But we have no need to depart from home for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, nor to cross the sea for the sake of virtue. For the Lord has said before, the kingdom of heaven is within you.
To return to the point at which I digressed, the blessed Paul had already lived on earth the life of heaven for 113 years, and Anthony, at the age of 90, was dwelling in another place of solitude when the thought occurred to the latter that no monk more perfect than himself had settled in the desert. However, in the stillness of the night, it was revealed to him that there was farther in the desert a much better man than he, and that he ought to go and visit him. The venerable old man, supporting and guiding his weak limbs with a staff, started to go. But what direction to choose he knew not. Scorching noontide came, with the broiling sun overhead, but still he did not allow himself to be turned from the journey he had begun.
So Anthony sets forth to find a companion, a guide, a spiritual father. He doesn't know where he's going to find one, but he knows there's somebody out there. This is somebody who's looking for something. And what he's looking for is guidance.
Anthony traversed the region on which he had entered, seeing only the traces of wild beasts and the wide waste of the desert. What to do, which way to go, he knew not. Another day had now passed. One thing alone was left him: his confident belief that he could not be forsaken by Christ.
I believe in my God. Sometime or other, He will show me the fellow servant He promised me. Allah! Where in these parts is a servant of God living?
Whether the devil took this shape to terrify him, or whether it be that the desert, which is known to abound in monstrous animals, engenders that kind of creature also, we cannot decide. He saw not far away a she-wolf, gasping with parching thirst and creeping to the foot of the mountain.
Eventually he comes to the mountain where we know that Paul is. Again, he doesn't explore it himself. He finds it because he sees a she-wolf entering into a cave and decides that he will follow the she-wolf in. So Antony is less independent than Paul is. Paul finds his own way. Antony finds it necessary at each stage to have direction.
They behold and they embrace one another. And I remember the first time I read it, I thought, it's almost like they're venerating God in each other. They immediately know that what is present in their midst is the Holy One.
Behold the man whom you have sought with so much toil, his limbs decayed with age, his gray hairs unkempt. You see before you a man who will, before long, be dust. But love endures all things. Tell me, how fares the human race? Are there homes springing up in the ancient cities? What empire directs the world?
We can imagine that desert anchorites or the desert fathers are actually very disconnected from the world and don't care about the things in the world. But this example where Antony and Paul sit together and actually talk about the affairs of the world shows that even though they are in their mountain caves, they are still very much aware and very much praying for the people in the world.
Are there still some remaining for the demons to carry away by their delusions?
The next scene is actually very delightful because we find that as they are sitting talking together, a raven comes and delivers an entire loaf of bread.
See, the Lord, truly loving, truly merciful, has sent us a meal. For the last 60 years, I have always received half a loaf. But at your coming, Christ has doubled his soldiers' rations.
Father, allow me, on the account of your age,
They both argue over who should actually break the bread first.
But it is I offering you hospitality. I should break the bread.
And so in the end, basically what they do is they hold opposite ends of the bread and they break it at the same time.
One of the joys one has to imagine that Anthony experienced is that he was not alone. And I think this is true for all of us who read the Desert Fathers. There is a longing within our hearts to know that we aren't alone in this struggle that we experience within the human heart, the confusion that we often experience, our own poverty. And when we read the writings of the Fathers, we see their ascetic struggles. We find that we are not alone.
Offering to God the sacrifice of praise, they passed the night in vigil.
I have known long since that you were dwelling in those parts. Long ago, God promised you to me for a fellow servant. But my time of falling asleep now draws near.
Paul explains to Antony that he is dying and so asks him to return back to his mountain cave to fetch the cloak that Athanasius had given him so that he could be buried in it.
Vuole essere sepolto nel mantello di Sant'Atanasio, ecco, che era il simbolo della lotta contro eresia, la purezza della fede, no? Ecco. Voglio stare in sintonia, in comunione con il grande Atanasio.
My course is finished, and there remains for me a crown of righteousness. Therefore, you have been sent by the Lord to lay my poor body in the ground. Wherefore, be so good as to go and fetch the cloak that Bishop Athanasius gave you to wrap my poor body in.
The Blessed Paul asked this favor not because he cared much whether his corpse, when it decayed, were clothed or naked. Why should he indeed, when he had so long worn a garment of palm leaves stitched together? Rather, he asked for this favor that he might soften his friend's regrets at his imminent death. Anthony mentally worshipped God without venturing to add a single word and set out on his return to the monastery.
Father Anthony? Father Anthony, where have you stayed so long?
I have seen Elijah. I have seen John in the desert. I have truly seen Paul in paradise.
So Anthony, who's already made one long trip across the desert to find Paul, now rushes into the cave, gets Athanasius' cloak, comes out, doesn't take time to eat, heads back across the desert, gets to the cave to give Paul the cloak, and finds Paul in a posture of prayer. So he falls down beside him to pray with him, but then notices he doesn't hear any sound of breath.
This is how he has died. He's died in a posture of prayer. That in itself is remarkable.
So the surprising end to the story is that Anthony didn't have the strength to dig in the hard desert rock to bury Paul. And so lions came to his aid. This is really a vision of the restoration of harmony between man and the animals, the harmony that existed in Eden.
It gives witness, I think, to Anthony of the depth of Paul's sanctity, how much and how fully he lived for God.
I may be permitted at the end of this little treatise to ask those who do not know the extent of their possessions, who adorn their homes with marble, who string house to house and field to field. What did this old man in his nakedness ever lack?
It can be an easy thing to look at the Desert Fathers as a curiosity, as entertainment, right? Because they're so different, because they're so out there, because they're so extreme. It can be easy to read them that way and to kind of dismiss them, to think of them as folk figures, as figures in fairy tales you tell your children. But that's not their function. What they show us is that no matter where we are, we need to observe the disciplines, and we need to have a singularity of focus as they had. We need to have Christ at the center of our lives.
We need to be ready for eternal life. Eternal life has begun now by our baptism, by the seeds of glory planted in our souls. We need to look after them, we need to prepare, we need to train, we need to fight hard for the kingdom of heaven.
The lesson of the Desert Fathers is you have to walk away from a lot of things that make you comfortable. And you have to bear the opprobrium of the world in doing that. And you have to be prepared to look mad to everybody else.
The Desert Fathers were living icons of Christ. And so it's their lived life, more than their writings, that speak to us. And if their writings speak to us, it's because we know that it arose out of experience, of a knowledge, not simply of the mind and of human judgment and reason, but the experience of the living God. And if there's going to be a renewal of the church, and if it's going to speak to our generation, it has to be something similar. It has to arise out of an experiential knowledge of God that comes through seeking Him above all things.